Welcome to Short and to the Point, a podcast from the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Here's your host, Jessica Kleinschmidt.
Welcome back to Short and to the Point here on the Comeback in Awful Announcing. Jess Kleinschmidt here. The London series is coming up where the Mets and the Phillies will face off on ESPN. It'll be Michael Kay, Doug Glanville, and Tim Kurkjian. What better guest than to have the man himself, Tim Kurkjian. He'll be an analyst for the game. When I tell you, I fangirled. A lot of people grew up, and don't get me wrong, like I watched a lot of cartoons. I was a My Little Pony girl, but I also evened that out with Sports Center and Baseball Tonight. And it was Jason Stark, Buster Olney, and Tim Kurkjian. Out of those three, we've had two of them, not on this podcast, but I've interviewed them this year. To know that I am even in the same realm as these guys blows my mind. And the one thing I learned from Tim is the storytelling ability. I got my start as a writer in this industry, and I say it all the time. The writing helped everything I do. TV, radio, podcasts, all of it. And to know that that's similar to his journey is really, really cool. I am not Tim Kurkjian at all, but to know that we truly love the art form of the written word and how poetic and gorgeous it is super important to me. So he gave me a few minutes of his time, and I can't wait for you to listen to our conversation. So without further ado, here is that. All right, well, Tim Kurkjian is here. I am trying not to fangirl. I'm going to calm down as much as possible. I'm a big fan of your work. And I think about, growing up watching you on TV and just knowing your background. It's kind of interesting. You go from this young beat reporter to now you're calling the London series. So when you think about how much baseball coverage has changed, what comes to mind?
Well, first off, I'm wearing my Walter Johnson t-shirt here, sweatshirt here. I went to Walter Johnson High School in Bethesda, Maryland, named after the greatest pitcher of all time. I worked for the school paper. It was called The Pitch. I did some work for the yearbook. It was called The Wind Up. So I always felt like I've always had a little bit of destiny involved in making a career out of baseball. But to answer your question, this wasn't supposed to happen. All I ever wanted to do was to be a baseball writer. And once I finally learned how to write, which believe me, took a long time, television just came along when I was like 40 years old. It kind of came out of nowhere. I had no interest in doing it. But once I started doing it and I recognized how immediate it was and how cool it was to be able to weigh in right now on something, as opposed to waiting for tomorrow's newspaper or at Sports Illustrated for when the magazine came out on Thursday, the immediacy of it is what has really appealed to me. And I've really grown to enjoy liking TV. I mean, I spent a fortune on clothes and I wear more makeup than my wife, and I still spend a lot of time walking around in a circle talking to myself, but that's all part of the gig. And I still love TV because it has brought many other things into my life, including a trip to England.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about like the baseball writing years were some of the best and hardest of your life. What kind of comes to mind when you think about some of those hardships that you dealt with when you were a young beat reporter?
Yeah, I did the beat for 10 years, and it was by far the hardest job I've ever had, and by far the most satisfying job I've ever had, because you were in charge of the team. Your newspaper was counting on you when you missed a story. And I missed a few, believe me, especially that first year. There was no worse feeling in the world. I can still feel that terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach that I missed a story, because it wasn't just me that lost, my newspaper that lost, and my boss would call me and scream at me. And I said, all right, I'm never going to experience this again if I can possibly have it. So it was a great job, but being a part of the team every day, Jess, it was like being it was like writing a book about the season, and every game was another chapter. And if you were really interested in what you were doing, and believe me, I was really interested, every day was different. Every day, even though the might have been the same game as yesterday, seemingly there was always something different. So those 10 years that I did the beat were the 10 best years of my whole life. And most important, taught me how to do everything else that I do in this business. Everything I do on the radio, everything I do on TV, and everything I do anywhere was all because of what the newspaper business and the beat taught me: how to get a story, where to find it, how to write it, how to present it, and how to get it in on time. All of that was derived from being on the beat.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear that that was the foundation of everything that you're doing now. And I wanted to talk to you about the London series coming up June 9th on ESPN. So it'll be you, Michael Kay, and Doug Glanville. Quite the cast of characters there. What are we looking forward to with this dynamic of you three?
Well, first off, I went last year and did the series, the Cubs and the Cardinals, with Michael Kay and Alex Rodriguez. So instead of being in the booth like I normally am, I was the dugout reporter. So I was the guy who did the man about town interviews to fans in Great Britain. It was pretty funny. I probably asked 24 people if they've ever heard of Michael Kay. And of course, all 24 said, I've never heard of him. I asked if anyone has ever heard of me. The answer was an emphatic no. So I finally found someone who had heard of Alex Rodriguez, and he said, yeah, I loved him, especially when he was with the Oakland A's, which of course.
I remember that.
So it was great. But what I was really struck by my trip to England last year was how interested the players on the Cardinals and the Cubs were in the surroundings. Like, this was an adventure to them. Cody Bellinger came up to me with a look on his face that I don't think I've ever seen. And he said, we went to Westminster Abbey today. Can you believe it? I've never been in such an amazing place in my life. It's like 1,000 years old. And Miles Michaelis of the Cardinals told me that he played in Japan for 3 years. And he said, I remember like 3 games that I played in Japan all those years, but I'll never forget the places that I went in Japan. Mm-hmm. So he was all over London for the cultural experience. And Paul DeYoung, shortstop for the Cardinals, looked at me at the batting cage and said, isn't it interesting how every great civilization was built on a river? That's what a shortstop told me at the batting cage. Needless to say, I've never heard that from any baseball player. It was just so beautiful how they went there to play 2 games that really mattered and they really cared. But it was the experience that I think really was the most important thing for them. And that's very encouraging to see that and to hear that.
Definitely. And I think you stopped by the Dan Patrick show last year to talk about the upcoming London series. And he straight up asked, why MLB in London? And you were talking about how we're trying to globalize the sport. And it's certainly shown over the years that that's taking place. But do you think it's making a positive trajectory? Are we on our way to making it more global?
Yes, there's no doubt. This is a global game. Look, I'm not being critical. Football, I always worry about playing all over the country, all over the world. And to me, football is still as international as the International House of Pancakes. It's just not there. But baseball has players from all over the world playing. And London is a place where I think we can develop new fans. Now, keep in mind, my mother grew up in England. She grew up in Bournemouth. So she moved here when she was 22 years old. So I grew up to stories of cricket and rounders and all this other stuff. And so when I went back to England, which I've been multiple times now, there was a connection there. And I'm not suggesting that, that Great Britain people really love the game and really truly understand it, but they're on their way to appreciating. The crowds were great last year. I met all sorts of people who are trying to learn the game. It's a difficult game to learn when you haven't grown up with it, but I think we're starting to get it, and I'm all for playing baseball all over the world. I don't think there's any downside to it other than a lot of travel.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is when you're trying to explain baseball to somebody, the nuances or whatever, the innings, the outs, what have you. But you have a storyteller background, which helps your coverage, of course. And the way that you describe baseball is so beautiful. There's such a romantic essence to it. So does that help you when you're trying to introduce somebody, whether they're from London or Poughkeepsie, when you're trying to introduce them to the sport, your storytelling background, that has to help?
Well, I try to explain to people that, especially people who live in London, like it's such an old place, that baseball is the only sport where the modern era is defined as 1900 odd.
Yeah.
That's the modern era. And that's what I try to tell people is the sense of history that this game has. It goes back farther than any other sport. And I believe, and I know I'm in the minority on this, that things that happened 100 years ago, players that played 120 years ago, are still relevant today. I just don't think you can say that about football or basketball because they are such athletic sports, and those sports are so much more and less. But baseball has so much skill involved in it. I think Hannes Wagner could play in today's game, and he was a star in 1902. No one else believes that, but I do. And I think that's part of the reason that I love to tell stories is the stories matter. Babe Ruth still matters today. Lou Gehrig, we're going to celebrate him on Sunday. He matters today. Ty Cobb just got passed on the all-time batting average list by all sorts of people, and it's because we still remember who Ty Cobb is. That's why I love baseball for a million different reasons. Its history and tradition is just richer than others.
And it's kind of cool because we can still stick to the history and how rich it is, but we're still adopting new aspects to the game. I mean, that's the new rules, what have you. Do we have a good balance of, the pitch clock, but still staying true to what baseball actually is?
Yes, I totally agree that the pitch clock has been a good development for the game. I like it. Most of the other rules I can live with. The DH, I'd rather see pitchers hit. I will tell you, some of the greatest notes and greatest stories I've ever written were based on a pitcher hitting a grand slam in the ninth inning of a game. I mean, we no longer have that. So frankly, I miss that. I think we're getting a little more action back in the game. We are valuing the hit a little bit more. We're running more, certainly. Sorry, Jess, but we have to get rid of the runner on second base to start the
Don't apologize. I'm right there with you. I agree.
We are in the vast minority of people who don't like this. I just think the game was played beautifully for 150 years, and there was no ghost runners during that time. But everything else, look, I'm 67, but I'm willing to go along with all sorts of changes as long as they make the game better. And I think we've done a pretty good job adopting changes that make the game better, because when it starts to drag a little bit, and it did a few years ago, too many homers, too many walks, too many strikeouts, too many 3.5-hour games, something has to be done. So I'm in favor of it to a degree.
Yeah. And I will say, I'm definitely getting spoiled because we had a 3-hour plus game the other day against the Rays and previously the Rockies. And it felt like a 5-hour game because I'm finally adjusted to the 2-hour plus game. And I can't believe we just used to do that all the time. So it's kind of interesting to adopt that. When you found out you were in the Writers Hall of Fame, I believe you were picking up a rotisserie chicken at the grocery store when you found out. Tell me a little bit about that story and what that honor means to you.
Yeah, well, I was at the Harris Teeter grocery store, and I thought, if the call is going to come, I was told it would come at 11:30 in the morning, so I had time to go do grocery shopping. And since I was a nervous wreck anyway, which I always am, and I go to the grocery store every day anyway, I was dragging a rotisserie chicken through the self-serve scanner when Jack O'Connell called, and he only calls if you win. So I thought, oh my gosh, this could be it. And I literally started to cry right there at the Harris Teeter. I mean, I'm not sure that's ever happened from any recipient of this award. So the next morning, after I got through 24 hours, Johnny Bench, the greatest catcher of all time, called me on the phone. And Jesse said, Tim, it's Johnny Bench. I just wanted to welcome you to the club. You're one of us now. So I'm thinking, I told him, Johnny, come on. I'm not one of you. I'm not one of them. I'm a writer. You're players. There's a real big difference there. And, and then he says to me, he says, Tim, it's moments like this that take you back to Little League. And here I'm just about ready to start to cry again. And Johnny says, and let's face it, Tim, you could still fit into a Little League uniform. So Johnny Bench made me laugh while almost making me cry. And ever since that day, my life has changed. I could tell you 1,000 stories, but I won't. But that weekend in Cooperstown is like nothing I will ever forget. It was the greatest professional moment of my life. And I can't imagine anything coming close to topping that.
But it's also kind of cool just from a journalistic perspective where a guy who played the game is saying, no, you're part of this category. Yes, he played and you wrote about the game, but for him to accept you as a member of we're all on the same playing field, pun intended, that must have felt really awesome.
Yeah. So we went after I made my speech, which I almost didn't make it through, even though it was okay in the end. I was as nervous as I've ever been in my life doing anything. I was terrified, and I practiced it out loud 200 times. So
wow.
I didn't foul it up. Point is, after I made my speech, the same Johnny Bench sees me in the lobby of the Otesaga Hotel. He takes me out onto the porch, and he says, and it's overlooking this unbelievably gorgeous lake. He says, I want you to sit down and I want you to look at that lake for 1 minute. I don't want you to say a word. I just want you to think about where you are, how you got here, and how many people helped you get here. And I looked at that lake with me and the greatest catcher of all time sitting side by side. And I teared up again because he took the time to take me out there. That was his way of saying, now you are here. He does this with all the Hall of Fame players. Every time a new one gets in, he has them do the same thing. This time he did it for a writer, and I still get choked up thinking about that.
And you've written a lot, so many things. What was the process writing a quick story compared to writing this speech? What were the similarities and differences?
Well, I usually don't cry through any stories that I write, but I cried.
Baseball makes me cry all the time, Tim. Yes, it makes me cry all the time. Yeah.
I'm with you. I cried through my speech multiple times because I mentioned my mother and father. I mentioned my brother who has since passed from ALS. So that's what made it so much different than anything else I've written. The tone had to be perfect, and I had to make sure that I recognized the right people, which in the end, I'm sure that I did. But that was the hardest exercise ever. And I almost didn't get through it physically because it was just so taxing to me. I kept saying, if I foul this up, I will never forgive myself. And thank goodness I didn't foul it up.
But the interesting part is you said you were a terrible writer in high school. So what did you write to define yourself as a terrible writer?
Well, I worked for the school paper, and I guess I just wasn't very good. One of my gym teachers, Mr. Klein, came up to me my senior year and said, Tim, that might be the worst story I've ever read in the high school paper. He said, I hope you're not planning on making this your life's work. That's what he told me when I was 17 years old. So that was an epiphany for me. I looked at it and I said, am I really that bad? Was this story really that bad? And the answer was yes. So now it became a competition that I better get better at this. If this is ultimately what I want to do for a living, because I'm going to graduate at 5'3" and 115 pounds. So I'm not playing baseball or basketball in the NBA or the big league. So how am I going to stay in sports? How am I going to stay in baseball? I better learn how to write. So as much as Mr. Klein, he didn't even realize he was encouraging me, he angered me enough, and rightfully so, to say, all right, I better get way better at this. And that's when I really started to concentrate on writing. And my mother was a great writer, so I knew there must be something inside of me. It just took a little while to bring it out.
Are we still staying true to the actual art form of letters and writing? Because like I'm obsessed with writing, and I know that as we get older and technology is shifting, everything is a tweet now. It's in 280 characters. I love a good story. I love a good written article. I love poetry. Do you think that art is still around?
No, sadly, I think we've lost quite a bit of that. Again, Jess, I worked for Sports Illustrated for 8 years. Oh my gosh, the level of expertise and precision at that place taught me, if I didn't already know, that the written word is absolutely crucial and in longer form than shorter form. I worry tremendously that we've gotten away from really telling a story. We want to do it in a tweet. We want to do it in 5 paragraphs, not 50 paragraphs. And it worries me that we're not willing to read like we used to. I would love to get away from that. I would love to make sure we try to get it right rather than getting it first. There are a lot of things that worry me, but I have met a lot of kids along the way, college kids, high school kids, who are wicked smart and they can really write. But we still need to make sure they recognize that eventually you got to take your head out of your cell phone and your computer and you got to go speak to another human being. You have to go look someone in the eyes and talk to them, interview them. That's where the stories come from. And it worries me a little bit that we've kind of gotten away from that.
And do you think that that approach has changed? Like, I feel like when I started my career, you're right. You just had to go talk to somebody and your whole job shifts around that. It's not something you can really teach, though, necessarily either. You have to have just a confidence and an approachability about you. That part of journalism, I think, remains the same.
Right. There's no doubt. And again, I try to advise high school and college kids that you need to go meet somebody and you try whatever you can to not make it an interview, but make it a conversation between two people. Find something about the athlete or the person you're talking to that you can relate to, that someone can relate to you. That's what we need to get to, is to sit down with a player and then understand, I'm just talking to this guy. I'm not even interviewing him. I'm talking to him. Is that easy to do? Of course it's not. I had tremendous trouble with that early on. Everyone does. But once you get more comfortable in the way to ask a question, which we know is still the hardest part about this job. How do I ask the right question here? In which form do I ask the question? Do I open with a joke? Do I open with this? How do I get it going where this guy trusts me, where he's going to speak to me? I still think about that every single time I go speak to anyone, even after all these years. This is what our young people need to understand, is you have to somehow create a connection with the person you're talking to. It'll make your interview so much better.
Yeah. And you can sense that on the broadcast or in the writing, because you're getting certain things out of them. And it's such a beautiful art. I kind of like the challenge of it now, like being able to figure that part out. I'm going to go back to Johnny Bench and just like the things he said about you. But you're so humbled about some of these things. You know, he'll call you and you've been called a treasure. You've been called as good as they come. How do you react to some of these sentiments? Because you're certainly humble about it all. And it's worth getting these compliments, but you don't have an ego about you. Where does that come from?
Well, thank you. That comes from my mother and my father. My father was a brilliant man who had a tremendous feel for baseball, really good player growing up, went to MIT, undergrad, PhD in mathematics. So he taught me, among many, many things, don't take yourself too seriously, but take your job seriously. So you ask how I am. I try to be humble. Is, Jess, we have another game tomorrow, okay? It doesn't matter what I've done up till today. If I screw up the game tomorrow, then I have lost. You can't look back and say, oh, I did this really well in 1989. Well, it's now 2024 and you wrote a lousy story. It's 2024 and you did a poor job analyzing this game, or you were lousy on Baseball Tonight. That's what drives me, and that's what keeps me humble. Is there's another game every single day, and you have to show up and compete. Otherwise, you're not doing your job.
It's interesting because you talk about having a bad Baseball Tonight. There's so much pressure on reporters, broadcasters, and analysts to be perfect. And I don't think we should compare ourselves to the baseball players, but I do tend to do that because they're failing all the time at the highest level of professionalism. So when you dealt with your first adversities, the first pushbacks, the first failures, how did you react to those, and what keeps you coming back as opposed to running and hiding?
Well, the first setbacks were so embarrassing that I said, I will never allow this to happen again. Like the first time I really got beat on a story, it was humiliating and I lost. And as I told you, it became a competition that I can't lose anymore because I won't be able to sleep at night. I had some major failures early on. I'll tell you a quick story. Larry Parrish was playing for the Rangers in 1984. He missed a game because his wife had a baby. So I have to write in the Ranger notes from the Dallas Morning News that Larry Parrish missed a game because his wife had a baby. He'll be back tomorrow. So I asked Doug Rader, the mischievous manager of the Rangers, is the baby okay? Is it a boy or girl? So he tells me it's a boy. His name is Buford. So I know Doug Rader is the mischievous manager. So I push him like 3 times. His name can't be Buford. He goes, I swear to God, his name is Buford. So I put it in the paper that Larry Parrish's wife had a baby and his name is Buford. Well, Larry shows up at the park the next day. He comes up to me and he goes, Kurtj, the boy's name ain't Buford. His name was Joshua. I got his name wrong and it was in the paper. And I went to Doug Rader and I said, how could you do that to me? I asked you, you swore to me. He goes, I didn't think you believed me. I said, oh my God. So the kicker to the whole thing is when Joshua Parrish used to get in trouble as a young kid, like a 7-year-old, he would do something wrong. His parents would say, Buford, no, you're not supposed to do that. So in some bizarre way, I helped in the raising of Joshua Parrish.
You sure did.
His name wrong in the paper. The point of this, Jess, is you have to be right. Accuracy is all that matters. And even though no one got hurt by this, you miss a person's name, you get the score wrong, you get a fact wrong, you get an entire story wrong, you have lost so badly that eventually your credibility is going to be seriously at stake. And when you lose your credibility, you're in a lot of trouble.
Do you think that they have like clips of that article that they have to have, right?
It's out there in the Dallas Morning News. It was so long ago. I hope no one remembers that. And I only say that because if we don't have a good chuckle in this game once in a while, it will crush us. It's the hardest game in the world to play for me. It's the hardest game in the world to cover because it never ends, especially now. It's 24/7 every day, 162 games a year. You got to have a chuckle. You got to be able to laugh with yourself. You have to be able to acknowledge what an idiot I was that day, but you get past it and you just tell yourself that's never going to happen again.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm obsessed with failing. I think it's so important to who I am as a person. I want to talk about this art of broadcasting, and Vin Scully comes to mind. Just what he could do was just as important as when he didn't. And I mean that by he let the game tell itself. He was a great storyteller. He would give you chills, but he also had a way of letting the game be the game. What was it like introducing that part into your craft of just letting the baseball game play?
Yeah, that is so crucial for a play-by-play guy and an analyst, which I am, to understand what the playing of the game is all about. And I learned so much as a little kid listening to the Washington Senators games on my transistor radio like every other kid in the 60s. I learned so much listening to Kurt Gowdy do all those games growing up when in the 60s, 70s, 80s. He was my all-time broadcasting hero. And then I started listening to Vin Scully when he started doing national games. And I just said, this is unbelievable how good he is. And all the other broadcasters, as you know, Jess, they all say that when Vin starts to tell a story, it's guaranteed that there's going to be a 12 pitch at bat here, which is going to give him time to tell the story. And the other broadcasters will tell you, every time I start to tell a story, the guy grounds out to the shortstop on the first pitch and we got to pick it up next inning. This is what I knew Vin was the greatest, is I'm driving around listening to XM radio, which, by the way, is the greatest invention ever. You just press a button and you get the Dodger games in the middle of the afternoon in Gaithersburg, Maryland, where I live, in perfect crystal clear, instead of me sitting in my car in college listening to Jack Buck from 1,500 miles away doing KMOX in St. Louis. So I'm driving around and Vin is talking about Socrates Brito, an outfielder for the Diamondbacks. And during the Socrates Brito at bat, which takes like 12 pitches, he explains who the real Socrates was. He gives his entire history, like this guy existed at a time around the time of the Trojan horse. That's how he weaved through who Socrates was without missing a pitch, fastball up and away. And then Socrates taught us. That's when I said, all right, this is what we all need to learn. We are all storytellers on the air. We need to weave things in, but we can never lose contact with the game. Vin was the best of all time at that.
Yeah, and it's really cool to watch people introduce non-baseball things into baseball, still staying true to the sport. I just love watching the challenge of it all. You and your son have a podcast. What's that journey been like?
It may be topping Cooperstown as the highlight of my career because my son is 30 years old. He's a music talk radio show host in Philadelphia. Does a show 6 to 10 every morning where, they play a Kenny Chesney song, then come out and say a few jokes. And now we do our father-son baseball podcast, which is great because he knows everything about music. He can also play the piano. He can sing. He's so talented. It's unbelievable. He knows everything about pop culture. And his poor Pop, his poor dad, I don't know anything about anything other than baseball and basketball and sitcoms from the 60s. That's it. I don't know anything else. I don't know anything about music. So we're actually a pretty good blend that every once in a while he'll say, like in our first episode, I was talking about Kent Herbeck of the Twins, way before Jeffrey was born. So he looked at me after, we're almost off. He goes, Dad, who is Kent Herbeck? Well, I ask him all the time, who is this recording artist? Who is this actress? What is this movie? Because I don't know anything. So it's a very playful, it's a very fun, it's a very respectful podcast where there's no heavy lifting. We're not breaking any news. It's once a week. And we're talking about, if something important needs to come up, we'll talk about it, but we're here to learn and we're here to laugh. And that's what we're trying to do every week. We're 10 weeks in. We've had some amazing guests, and it's been a joy of a lifetime to work with my son for the first 10 weeks of this podcast. And
you guys sound alike too. It's really, you guys do.
Yeah, and it's terrible that we sound alike, that there are two voices that sound like this. So my son used to work in Las Vegas, and he worked with a woman named Amy, co-host, and Jeffrey has a rather grating voice like mine. I mean, after a while, it can just drive you crazy. I recognize that, all right? So Amy spends like 12 straight hours with my son, on the air, off the air, 12 straight hours. She's sitting right next to him. She finally gets free of him, and she goes home. She opens up a bottle of wine, and she turns on the TV thinking, finally, I'm away from that voice. And she turns it on, and I'm on Baseball Tonight. And there I am. This is the first thing she the first thing she hears is my terrible voice. So she couldn't get away from it. Yeah, after a couple of episodes, that was some of the feedback we got. Yeah, you guys sound exactly the same, which I repeat is not good.
I disagree, but that's okay. But you have the voice that's like it's a baseball related voice, so it's comforting. Like if you're on the broadcast, like I feel like everything's going to be okay. But it's been kind of interesting to see people adopt you over the years. Like you have Holland doing impressions of you, and then you have memes about you and people embracing who you are into the latest pop culture. And you're an old school guy. That's been really cool to watch your journey being introduced in the different forms of media coverage for this game.
Yeah, like 12 years ago is when the impersonations, by the way, began. And that's all Tito Francona's fault, by the way. He ambushed me in Toronto Blue Jays camp after he found out that JP Arancibia loves to do an impersonation of me. It's a long story. I'm not going to take 20 minutes to tell it. But the bottom line is after JP Arancibia impersonated me on the air when I didn't even know it was coming, all sorts of people, players I went to, like the next camp, Elliot Johnson, and then the camp after that, Tim Dillard, and then Ryan Dempster, and all these guys did me. Finally, after all this, I went to JP Arancibia and I said, please tell me that you impersonate other people. Please tell me that you do a great Jack Nicholson. And he goes, no, I can only do you. So I guess it's a compliment. I guess it's flattering. And I was very worried early on that I was being made fun of, and I looked like a non-journalist. I looked stupid. I called my dear friend, my mentor, Dan Shaughnessy of the Boston Globe, and I said, Dan, look, this has gotten out of control the last 3 or 4 days. I just want you to tell me as my mentor, is this okay to do this? He said, Tim, this is television gold. You're not going to lose your journalistic standing because someone wants to imitate your voice. So that's when I realized, okay, it's okay to do this. And my TV boss said, Tim, we'll stop doing it, but this is television gold because everyone is laughing at this. And I repeat, Jess, you have to have a good chuckle in this game once in a while. Otherwise, it'll spit you out. It's too hard. It's too much to cover if you don't poke fun at yourself once in a while.
I agree. And I think it's important to show that you can do all of that because a lot of people just want to stay to one side or the other, but it's okay to have a healthy balance. Before I let you go, your relationship with baseball, the way you describe it, you use the term beautiful a lot and why it is so beautiful. What has your relationship with baseball been like since you started? Has it changed at all, or is it still relatively the same?
No, it's still the same. And that's why I'm still doing it at 67 after almost 45 years of doing this. Is I still think it's a beautiful game. I still love to wake up at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, drink a diet Mountain Dew, which I'm not suggesting is a good idea, and reading the box scores because things still jump out at me to this day that I look at and go, I've never seen that box score line before in my life. Manny Margot had a 4-1-1-5, 4 at bats, 1 hit, 1 run, 5 RBIs, and he didn't hit a home run. And he had a 4-1-1-5. I checked on it. That box score had never happened before. Wow. So that's what drives me, are quirky, crazy things like that, where you go, oh my gosh, we've been playing for 140 years, and I've never seen that before. I watched a pitcher throw his glove into the stands the other night. I've never seen that. I've said it 1,000 times. The reason I love baseball so much is that every day you go to the ballpark, you might see something you've never seen before. How many people can say that about their job? How many people can go to their job every day and think, something might happen today that is going to make me slap my forehead and go, I've never seen that. That's why baseball is so beautiful. And to finish the point, as much as I love basketball, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, LeBron, Steph Curry, they essentially always take the last shot of the game. They're always the critical player in the game, especially at the end. But in baseball, the 25th guy on the team might get up in the 9th inning and drive in the winning run. Anyone is capable of being the hero tonight. The 12th guy in an NBA game, and I love the NBA, the 12th guy is never in the game for the last minute. And if he is, he's not taking the last shot. But the last guy on the bench might be the last pitcher in the game, the last hitter in the game, the guy that wins the game. The star doesn't always determine the winner of a baseball game. And that's one of a million reasons why I still love to go to the games, to watch the games, and to read the box scores.
Yeah, there's definitely something magical and romantic about that aspect. I will agree. I am so honored that you were here. Like I said, I grew up watching you. I'm a huge fan of your work, and the fact that you can show different sides of you makes me a better journalist. And the fact that you're on my podcast right now is just fantastic. So I so appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. Last thing, not everyone recognizes me, by the way. I went through an airport not too long ago. This guy stops me dead in my tracks, doesn't even say hello. And he goes, "I've seen you before. Don't tell me where I've seen you. I know you." And then he says, "You work at Applebee's, don't you?" And I said, "No, I don't work at Applebee's." So eventually I explained what I do, and he still didn't understand. Not the point. The point is, thanks very much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Tim Kurkjian of Applebee's, everybody. Thank you so much.
Cousin Amy got me a polo shirt from Applebee's that's got Timmy written on it. Every once in a while, I just wear it around the house because that guy thought I worked at Applebee's.
Honestly, that's not a bad personality to take on. Everybody I've ever met at Applebee's is in a fantastic mood. So
I agree. I'm going to go in there one day wearing my Timmy shirt and see if anybody notices.
Yeah, hey, when does my shift start? Just let me know. Thank you, Tim. You're the best.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate it.
That was ESPN's Tim Kurkjian. Doesn't it give you warm fuzzies? It feels like the guy I used to watch. This is literally what happened. The guy I used to watch in my oversized shirt as a little girl eating Cheez-Its on the floor. I still do that. Doing that, teaching me about baseball and how to cover the game in such a beautiful way, an old school and a modern way. To have him on here in the flesh was just absolutely amazing. This is a really, really fun episode. So I thank you guys so much for listening. And if you adopt anything from this, it's that storytelling will never die in this sport, or in this, especially baseball, but in sports media overall. Thanks for tuning in to Short and to the Point on the Comeback and Awful Announcing. We'll see you next time.
Want even more short and to the point? Follow Jessica at Kleinschmidt JD and head over to thecomeback.com and awfulannouncing.com.